Hi, today's lectures is going to be about concepts of risk and disaster management. So some very basic topics and elements, and to see how those different elements come at play together. So for this lecture, I'm starting here with a photograph taken in Africa on Comoros Island. And where we can see here is a wedding ceremony. And you can see that they are carrying jewelry and on this panel here. So this is jewelry for the bride, and a lot of the money actually in the community goes into this jewelry that they show on display. And the reason why I chose this is because the choice that community makes or the culture play a very important role on resilience, on whether they will have a lot of money or not to work or do anything against natural hazards or to limit risks, for instance. And in that case, it's, because the community puts so much money in that jewelry, it's money that doesn't go somewhere else. I'm not saying that the culture is wrong. I'm just saying that the culture is having an impact on how the communities behave and what actually looks important, what actually is important for them. So what do you bring home today? I want you to learn a few definitions on natural hazards, risk capacity, some examples also of risk strategies. And I would like you to be able to use this concept and apply them to your own community. So that's the idea of transfer knowledge. I don't think it makes much sense for you to learn this lecture if you are not able actually to transpose those ideas somewhere else. So if you're in a class setting, you will see that you'll have a few exercises you can do. So you can pause the video and do those exercises. And if you're just in front of your computer, just like go through it. Maybe you want to pause for a second and think about it. And after that, just continue playing the video. Okay. The video might look like it's jumping a bit. Actually, they are doing fire testing in the building right now when I'm recording this. So I have to stop every 5 seconds to just restart. So here we go again. So the concept of natural hazard. So the concept of natural hazard, I put here natural in between commas because I don't think that you can see or say that hazards are purely natural anymore. Even processes, let's say when you have a flood in a river, the river is not purely natural. It has been modified by human beings. So it's really hard to say that what is happening in that river is fully natural. So how do you define it? So events that are associated with normal geophysical, biological processes that cause or that can cause death, injury, or loss of home, property, of income. The intensity of the hazard may be influenced by human modifications of the landscape, like deforestation, urbanization, or the climate as well. So the natural hazards basically is a process, something which is happening, and it becomes a hazard when the scale, when the frequency of that process starts to interact with human and human activity in such a way that it can start causing harm to those activities or to human beings. For instance, when you look at a small wave on the ocean, if it's 5 centimeters high and 5 centimeters high at the coast, it's just a wave. But if you change the scale of that wave, and that wave, which is now 5 centimeters, become 50 meters, well, it's a whole very different story. You're not playing by the sea anymore. So it's not that hazards are a typical process. They are general normal process that have reached a scale that become harmful or potentially harmful for human beings and human activities. And those different hazards can be differentiated in different ways. So this is a typology that has been made by Emmanuelle Bournet, and she divides different types of hazards, including also hazards that are purely man-made or of human origin, like war, you can see at the top here, like war here, industry, energy production. And then you have all the natural hazards at the bottom that are tectonic, climatic, right in there. And the combination, of course, of the two, like forest fires, desertification, pest invasion, that are really a combination of the human and the natural environment. So, from what precedes natural hazards are associated with extreme events in the normal operation of the planet's geological, hydrological, and ecological systems. Natural hazards are limited to inhabited area, so you have to remember that if there is nobody, it cannot become a hazard. You need humans in there anyway, like close to settlements and infrastructures as well. But one hazard doesn't impact a society the same way because we all have different societies. We all live in different systems. Think about your own country, wherever you are, right now, and 400 years ago. The vulnerability to a drought, for instance, or to a flood was very different. So for the same density of population, what you can do today against what you could do 400 years ago might be very different. It might be the same, but it might be very different. Most of the time, in most cases, we will improve actually the way we live with those hazards. And on the slide that you have in front of you, that's an example that you have where it's plotted the death between 1 and 1,000 people against the magnitude of pseudo earthquake between 1 and 10. And let's say if the earthquake occurs in California with a magnitude 6 or 7, it might have actually the same effects on the population than a much slower earthquake in Peru or Iran, for instance. If you take Japan, that has been living for years, decades for its history with earthquakes, they have buildings that are built actually to sustain a powerful earthquake without killing people inside the building. And even in historical times, when you look at the design of temples, temples were built actually to withstand earthquakes with pillars that are meant to be able to move during an earthquake and not break. Like maybe, for instance, it would be in France when you have cathedral or church that is made of stone. Those buildings are not really made to sustain earthquake. And it happens what we have seen in Italy, for instance. Those stone buildings tend to easily collapse. So you can see that the culture, the country, the place actually where you are, depending on how you build, but also how you live in buildings, is playing a very important role on the effect of a natural hazard. And that's the concept of vulnerability. The concept of vulnerability is to look at those events that we always or often look at disasters, disaster risk, from the human perspective. We're not looking at the hazard, but at the human in that case. So vulnerability, it's a multidisciplinary concept that can be used in public health, in ecology, DRR, climate change science, and by practitioners as well. So someone like Timmerman in 1981 said that vulnerability is quite a broad concept. So as you can see from above, to an extent it has become useless for careful description at the present, except as a rhetorical indicator of areas of greatest concern. Hopefully since 1981 we have done a lot of progress and we have worked on those ideas as well. And in the 70s and 80s, vulnerability that was a result of a fragile physical environment or structures on impact of disaster risk, this definition actually has changed, and the idea that we had has really changed. And if I give you one official view, is the one of the UNISDR, which is the United Nations International Strategy for Disaster Risk Reduction, that stated that vulnerability is the susceptibility of a community to the impact of disaster risk caused by physical, economic, social, political, and environmental factor. Well, you can tell me from 1981, so what's the progress? Here it's really important because in the 70s and in the 80s, we have been looking or focusing mostly on natural hazards, on what actually is the impressive, the big bang, almost Hollywood movie type of impact, instead of looking at what's more important, the human side. And UNISDR actually pushed this concept of vulnerability because it's very important to actually put the emphasis on the human. So to take contemporary definition of vulnerability, I've chosen the one of Ilan Kelman from 2007, which I think is really good. And it says, or it reads as follows: vulnerability and hazards combine in different ways to yield risk. The presence of risk leads to disasters. Without vulnerability, a disaster cannot happen, especially since vulnerable aspects of society, such as straightening a river to provide land for housing, for instance, along the banks, often cause a normal environmental event, such as water rising, to become a hazard, such as a dangerous flood. So what I would like you to do now is to eventually pause that video for a while and try to think, well, what about my community? What about the place where I live? Is there anything I should reflect on right now? And I'm sure there is. So maybe take 10 and think about it. Now, let's define another concept. This one, the concept of risk. So risk can be seen very simply as hazards times the vulnerability. Hazard has been the natural process capable of causing death or destruction, and vulnerability, what we've just seen, the social or economic sensitivity to the effects of hazards. So to give you some more definitions that have been given by scientists, Denis Mileti, for instance, defines a risk as the probability of an event or condition occurring, and Alwang et al. Define risk as a known or unknown probability distribution of events. And finally, Weichselgartner as highly complex, interdependent, and interactive decisions that may create increased risk to potential hazards. So Denis, Mileti, and Alwang are very fatalistic in their look into the risk as something which is out of our hand, controlled by hazards, which I think is kind of dangerous in some ways because it also limits our liability. Well, we can't do anything. While Weichselgartner engaged the human responsibility as well in the risk, which I think is very important if we want to get into the right mindset, mind frame to start doing something. So if we go back to vulnerability, so what causes vulnerability? Well, first, you can think about the demographic factors. Population concentrated in one area, it increases vulnerability. Children, for instance, they need support, they need family structure. Once all this is done, they are more vulnerable maybe than other adults. Elderly, same can be also in those situations. And there is everything which is also pertinent to the social fabric of a society. Like in a lot of societies, for instance, single mothers are in originally more difficult position with less resources, and it has been shown that during hazards and disasters, they are more deeply impacted than typical families. So what causes the vulnerability? Well, poverty, for instance. Poverty increases individual proneness to disasters and decreases capacity to cope. So again here, what you can see, it's not so much the hazards that comes at play. What is really important is the fact that that society already has some weakness or weak points, and hazards come and almost like use those weak points as an entry key to go and impact further those group of people, those people who can be seen almost as defavorized within a group. And you have everything which is related also to policy failures, for instance. So it's not only human beings or small groups, it's as a country, how much is being done, how much resources are being put to help actually during or after a disaster. So when the government is not having any procedures before something happens also, and react once losses have occurred, this is also a failure. So when you think about a couple of years ago, what happened with Katrina, there were no real plan in New Orleans to evacuate effectively and the emergency plan of New Orleans was a bit of a fiasco in some way. So, what about we stop crying about all those things, and what can be done? So there are two principles, at least two, there are others of course, for reducing disaster vulnerability and managing disasters: liability reduction and capacity building. So liability reduction is the diminution of risk and susceptibility, the reduction of risk, which is a proactive approach that plans for future events to safeguard properties, lives, etc. But that kind of plan fails to address what, when you think about it? Let's say about insurance companies or the country giving you money back when your house collapsed during an earthquake. What else comes on top of this? And you can pause here and think about it, but I'm going to give you the answer in the next slide. Well, what it fails to address as well is the non-physical elements, such as the cultural values, the traditions, the role of politics, and the economy. If you think about the 2011 earthquake and tsunami in the Tohoku area, where you have a lot of series of small bays next to each other, in each of the small bays, you had actually local practices, local variations in the language as well. And a lot of scientists have been pushing forward the fact that actually the tsunami, by wiping out the population there, wiped out also the memory of all of this. So it impacted the culture. The culture disappeared with the hazard. So it's not only impacting your physical body, it's also impacting your culture and your ability to transmit that culture as well. So it is the liability reduction, it is the diminution of risk and susceptibility, and we can then look at reducing susceptibility by addressing the social, cultural, political, economic, psychological, organizational variables related to disasters. So it's very complex because it's a lot of different views to try to bring together. And as I often say, at university or in school, we are used to be taught in boxes. So I go to the math class, I go to the English class, I go to the history and geography class, then physics class. And then all of a sudden, to solve problems related to natural hazards and disaster risk, we have to bring everything together. And unfortunately, we're not very good at doing this, and so are our institutions. But it requires big changes. That's why, actually. It requires big changes in the social network, as well as a solid emergency management organization, which is then really hard to put in practice. So capacity building, what is it? So capacity building is another important term of disaster risk reduction. It has been criticized a lot, but you still need to know about it. It's called the augmentation of resistance and resilience. The augmentation of resistance to resist the disaster is the improvement of structures for their resist hazards better. And augmenting resilience is the improvement of an individual and or community to respond and recover based on preparedness and other measures. And it's a very technocratic view of disaster reduction. That's why actually it's also being criticized so much. And of course, there are other approaches to that. You can think about everything which is the community-based approach. You don't have to go from the top down. And it has been shown that actually working with communities and getting into the community to get the message through is very important. That's why I put those pictures here. Actually, telling people what to do never works so well. What works better, and we'll see that into another lecture when we talk about community planning and working with communities to solve natural hazards and disaster risk, you'll see that actually working with them and empowering them, it's much more important than just telling them what to do. So finally, before I leave you at the end of this lecture, I would like you to think about your own experience again. And according to you, or your own knowledge and experience, I would like you to identify elements of vulnerability in your own community. So your community can be anything, can be the place you were born, the place you live right now, but it can also be your group of friends at university or wherever you're working. I think it's very important to think about your community in different places as something that has a moving boundaries, and you are living within different small communities. And all those different communities, because you are together at one time together, at that time, if something happened, how can you make yourself actually less vulnerable to a hazard? How can you make sure that you're resilient? It can be, for instance, that when you're at university, you have a stash of extra food, or you make sure that you always have water with you. When you're at home, it can be a lot of different things. If you're a business, it might mean that you discuss with your partners or your suppliers, if anything's going to happen, how do we get supply? Who's going to do the delivery? How is it going to work? How do we get in touch if the usual way we get in touch with each other doesn't work anymore? So all that needs actually some planning. So I would like you to think about all of this first, and you can pause here, do this exercise, and at the end, I'm showing you the literature and the different references that I have used for this presentation. Thank you.